Armies in East Africa 191-18 HE Strategic background: when Lieutenant Colonel Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck stepped ashore in German East Africa in January 1914, nobody guessed that within 5 years he would not only be feted by his countrymen for being the last German commander in the field to lay down his arms, but also admired and respected by his British opponents much as Rommel was to be during World War II. Von Lettow had arrived to take command of the military forces of German East Africa. This was the largest and most populous of Germany's colonies, a territory stretching from the Indian Ocean to the lakes and escarpments of Africa's Great Rift Valley. With the threat of war already looming over Europe and the colony surrounded by potential enemies, it needed a capable commander, and von Lettow had that background. The son of a Prussian general, he had general staff training and overseas experience, having served against the Boxers in China, in combat against the Herero in German Southwest Africa, and subsequently with the Marikorps, Germany's designated imperial reserve. In the overall context of World War I, German East Africa was of little importance. Its harbors might shelter commerce raiders preying on shipping in the Indian Ocean, but they could be blockaded. In any case, one of Governor Schnee's first acts was to agree to a Royal Navy demand that they become open ports. The treaty reason for the campaign was the Anglo-Belgian calculation that victory in East Africa would provide them with additional colonial territory, or at least a bargaining counter when peace came to be negotiated. For his part, von Lettow saw clearly that Allied troops engaged in East Africa could not be deployed in more decisive theaters. It was thus his duty to engage and tie down as many as possible, for as long as possible. In this he was to succeed brilliantly. The situation was complicated by the provisions of the Berlin Act of 1885. This had created a Central African Free Trade Area whose boundaries extended to the Indian Ocean and included the Belgian Congo along with British, German, and much of Portuguese East Africa. By its provisions, the imperial powers bound themselves to respect the integrity of each other's territories, provided that these were declared to be neutral. This would have been very much to the advantage of the native inhabitants, and both the German and British civil governors were in favor of the agreement. However, their military commanders were not, and at first neither the British nor German governments took any steps to issue such a declaration. The Belgians did, but the Germans had already shown what they thought of solemn agreements, declarations of neutrality by invading Belgium itself, so when they did make a belated attempt to persuade the Allies to agree to respect the neutrality of the African colonies, it stood no chance of success. Strategically, German East Africa was in an impossible position. It was bounded to the north by British East Africa, now Kenya and Uganda, which together equaled it in terms of military potential. To the west lay the Belgian Congo, with British Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland to the southwest. All these became hostile territories the moment war broke out. The Portuguese to the south were not only Britain's oldest allies but had a more immediate reason for hostility towards Germany. It was an open secret that the Germans coveted their territory, along with the Congo, and dreamed of seizing them to create a vast German Central Africa. The French had no frontier with German East Africa, but they were established in Madagascar, and unlike the other imperial powers had been building up their African forces with a view to employing them outside their home territories. In the event, the Portuguese did not enter the war until 1916, and the French had other uses for their African troops, but in 1914 both were threats which von Lettow had to take into account. The Germans did have one initial advantage, inasmuch as they had the most efficient of the local forces, and one which was better trained than the colonial levies of their adversaries. As with frontier lines of railways and the British-Uganda Railway, which ran parallel to the border and was not as was German equivalent protected by a range of mountains, could have dealt a serious blow to the Allied effort. Unfortunately for von Lettow, Governor Schnee was anxious to avoid any provocation and refused to let him concentrate the necessary troops until war had actually broken out. The Germans did then use the units they had on the northern front to capture Taveta, which commanded the only gap in the mountains, but it took time to bring up the rest of their troops. And by then the British had managed to get their own scattered forces into position and the opportunity had been lost. The forces in Place Germaine von Lettow commanded the Schutztruppe protective force. Each of the larger German colonies fielded such a force, though they differed considerably in terms of their recruitment and even armament. A degree of standardization had been laid down in 1895, but its main effect was to facilitate the cross-posting of white officers and NCOs. A general staff proposal to create an integrated colonial army in 1905 had not been approved, and the different forces remained organizationally separate. Like the Navy and the Marine Corps, they were administered directly by the imperial government rather than by one of the Reich's constituent kingdoms, as were most German units. The basic units were Feldkompanie Field Company. The spelling did not officially change to company until 1929. In peacetime this numbered about 160 men, but in time of war it was expanded to 200, divided into 3 platoons of some 40 men each, plus a signals platoon and 20 bandsmen. The scarce soldiers and most of their NCOs were recruited within the colony, but there were between 16 and 20 German officers and NCOs per company, a notably high proportion compared with most colonial forces, and one which had much to do with the demonstrable effectiveness of the force. These whites were all members of the regular army. The minimum tour was 2.5 years, but in practice many served for much longer, generally in the same colony. As a result, they were not only professionally competent but seasoned bushfighters as well. Interestingly, there were still 2 Effendis or African officers on the company's strength, a holdover from the early days when recruits had been sought as far afield as the Sudan and British South Africa. The African askaris were armed with rifle and bayonet. Although the Cameroon and Southwest African forces had been issued with the modern 7.9 mm caliber Mauser Gehör 98, there were only enough of these in German East Africa to equip the white ranks and 6 of the companies of askaris by the outbreak of war. The others still carried the Mauser and 1871 84th Jäger books, and 11 mm breechloader with a tubular magazine in the forestock. Its black powder cartridge produced a cloud of smoke, putting the askaris at a disadvantage when facing troops armed with more modern rifles firing smokeless cartridges. Each Feldkompanie had 7.9 mm Maxim machine guns, and frequently 1 or 2 37 mm quick-firing light field guns as well. Both were commanded by white officers or NCOs, as was usual in the colonial armies of the time. There was no separate artillery corps, and no cavalry either, the ravages of the tsetse fly squared ruling out the use of horses in most of the colony. This meant that supplies had to be carried on the heads of about 250 porters per company, many of whom, especially the gun carriers, were permanently assigned to the unit. There were usually a number of Rugaruga or irregulars attached in addition. These lightly armed and highly mobile tribesmen undertook the scouting and screening missions in the absence of cavalry. The Feldkompanie was thus as close to being an all-arms unit as the environment allowed. There were 14 numbered Feldkompanie FK, stationed at Aruska 1.FK, Oringa 2.FK, Lindy 3.FK, Dodoma 4.FK, Langenberg 5.FK, Ajiji 6.FK, Bukoba 7.FK, Tabor 8.FK, Arundi 9.FK, Dar es Salaam 10.FK, Rwanda 11.FK, Manhinj 12.FK, Koandairinji 13.FK, and Mwanza 14.FK. There was also a depot with 150 for men, giving an overall strength of some 260 German officers and NCOs and 2,470 to askaris. The number of companies had actually been reduced after 1909 by the transfer of about 60 Germans and 2,000 experienced askaris to the Polizeietruppe. This formed a useful reserve, though Governor Schnee wanted to keep them separate. Great Britain, British units in the British East African Protectorate, now Kenya, Uganda and Nyasaland, belonged to the King's African Rifles Corps. This corps had been formed in 1901 from units already in existence in the different colonies. Technically, it was not a part of the regular army, since it was administered by the Colonial Office and not the War Office. However, this was merely because experience showed that the African colonies needed troops who were more lightly equipped and thus more mobile than regular infantry battalions. They were also less expensive, which appealed to the treasury. It did not mean that they were less well armed, nor that their officers or white NCOs were in any way inferior. In fact, these men were all seconded from the British regular army and, given Britain's long experience of warfare in the tropics, they brought with them a wealth of experience. There had once been 6 car battalions, but 3 had since been disbanded. The remaining units had territorial links, the 1st Battalion being recruited in Nyasaland, the 3rd from British East Africa, and the 4th from Uganda. For historical reasons, the latter two had a proportion of Sudanese in their ranks, and the latter still had a number of Sudanese officers, who commanded the 4th platoon in each company. Their ranks were Usbashi Captain, Mulazim Awal 1st Lieutenant, and Mulazim Tani 2nd Lieutenant. The battalions were scattered over the region, 1st Corps having half its strength in the far northeast, and 3rd Corps Company in Zanzibar. They had also been reduced in size, so that in 1914 there were only 21 companies in all. These companies were only half the size of the Feldkompagnie of Germany's Schutztruppe, since the Corps still followed the pre-1913 British system of having 8 to a battalion. This meant that the force as a whole numbered a little less than the Schutztruppe. The actual establishment in 1914 was 70 British officers, 3 British NCOs and 2,325 Africans. The lower proportion of Europeans to Africans, 3% as opposed to nearly 10, was significant. If that was a source of weakness, the armament helped to redress the balance somewhat, since the Karascaris were all equipped with Lee Metford or Longley Enfield rifles in 1914. They also had 1 Vickers machine gun per company, since these were half the size of the German companies. The overall ratio was comparable. There were no artillery units as such, though light guns could be attached to columns in the same way as in the Schutztruppe, and no cavalry other than 1 camel company from 3rd Corps which remained in the far north. There was no organized reserve, and carrier services were arranged on a more ad hoc basis than in the Schutztruppe. And like Nyasaland, Northern Rhodesia to the south was administered by a chartered company, which was not entitled to maintain a military force as such. However, its armed constabulary resembled one in most respects. In fact, the British South Africa Police in neighboring Southern Rhodesia was even given regimental status and a colour in 1904. The Northern Rhodesia Police had been formed in 1911 by amalgamating the Northeastern Rhodesia and Barrettsland constabularies. Although it had a small civil branch, it was largely military in character, with a strength of some 450 askaris organized into 5 small companies along the same lines as the Corps. One significant difference was that each had 2 machine guns rather than 1. The British South Africa Company had shown that it knew the value of these weapons by pioneering their use during the 1890s in Matabeleland. However, the guns were Maxim Nordenfeldts, firing the old Martini Henry .45 in black powder cartridge. The rifles were Martini Metfords, which did at least fire the smokeless .303 in round, but were nevertheless single-shot weapons with all the extraction problems of their older parent. In this respect, therefore, the Northern Rhodesia Police were on a par with many of the Schutztruppe. All in all, the local forces in British East and Central Africa were a fair match for their adversaries in terms of strength and weaponry. Their weakness stemmed from a 1910 decision by the Committee of Imperial Defense that their role in the event of a major war was to be limited to internal security. Preparing them for more would have involved bringing the companies together periodically for battalion exercises, something the straitened colonial budgets did not permit. As a result, the British forces were skilled in small unit actions against tribal opponents, mobile, familiar with the terrain, and good at living off the land, but not yet ready for modern warfare. Nor did there seem to be any need, since the British had an alternative to hand in the shape of the Indian Army, which had acted as an imperial reserve for East Africa before. Belgium. The Belgian Congo's troops were known as the Force Publique. This title derived from the period when the territory had been a cross between an autonomous state and a commercial enterprise under the control of Leopold II, the Belgian king. Belgium had taken over the Free State in 1908, but it had not yet done very much to reform the Force Publique. It was not until 1914 that a commission recommended that it should be divided into troops colonials organized into regular battalions and a police territoriale. Even then, this was only to happen in time of war, which the Belgians believed their guaranteed neutrality would allow them to escape. The Force Publique was divided into companies. During the early days these had bore numbers, but this system had lapsed in 1897, and they were known now by the names of the districts in which they were stationed. In 1914 there were 21 of them, namely Bascongo, Cataracts, Stanleypool, Ubangi, Equator, Bangala, Kwango, Lac Leopold II, Lualaba Kasai, Irwini Ruby, Macubomo Kondi, Olbili, Macrocas, Stanley Falls, Benthierville, Monima, Ituri, Lilonga and Ruzizi-Kivu. Together with 6 trains, there was also a 200-strong company d'artillery at Dijini manning a fort at Boma at the mouth of the Congo River. This was armed with 8 160mm guns, which were among the largest ever mounted in Africa. Finally, there were the troops de Katanga. The chartered company's corps de police in that mineral-rich province had been taken over by the Force Publique in 1910, but the corps retained a certain autonomy and continued to be much more military in character than the other Congolese units. In 1914 it consisted of 4 companies de marche, 2 other infantry companies, a cyclist company and a battalion HQ. In 1914 the non-Katongan district companies had 12,133 men, the training camps 2,400, and the troops de Katanga 2,875, so that the Force Publique as a whole numbered some 17,000. This total far exceeded either the German or the British figures, but it must be remembered that the Congo was an immense territory. The average strength of the companies was close to 600 men, but most of these were supernumeraries who were dispersed in small, static police detachments and had lost much of their military potential. The Belgians planned to bring the corps effectives under the control of 3 more Katongan-style battalion Hs with majors in command, but only one of these was actually being formed when war broke out. Fortunately, it was the one intended to command the field troops in the eastern province, which bordered German East Africa, as indeed did Katanga. A marching company, the field as opposed to the administrative unit, was supposed to have 1 white captain, 1 other white officer and 2 NCOs, together with 8 native NCOs and 100 to 150 askaris. In theory it was subdivided into pelotons of 50 men each, but shortly before 1914 reductions in the number of white cadres meant that these actually expanded to 70 to 75 askaris each. In the field the companies could be supplemented by bands of native auxiliaries, together with trains of porters. There were no cavalry units, but many of the companies had sections with light artillery pieces. The old Force Publique had employed many adventurers from other European countries as officers, and recruited many of its original askaris from Zanzibar and British West Africa. But by 1908 these had all been phased out, and the whites were almost all Belgians and the rank and file Congolese. Official policy was to mix the latter up, so that no more than a quarter of them came from the province within which they were stationed. Under the previous administration the Free State had been notorious for a ruthless pursuit of commercial gain, and while the Belgian national administration was more enlightened, a desire to keep costs down meant that the Force Publique continued to have an unusually low ratio of white cadres to askaris. In 1914 this was just under 2%. Most of the Force Publique's askaris carried ex-Belgian Army single-shot 11mm Albini rifles, though its white ranks were issued with Belgian M1889 7.65mm Mauser rifles and Browning pistols. Maxim machine guns were in use, apparently on the usual scale of 2 per company. The main artillery pieces were the 75mm Krupp mountain gun first introduced in 1883, and the 47mm Nordenfeld. The troops de Katanga were better armed, with M1889 Belgian Mausers and Madsen light machine guns. Portuguese garrison in Mocambique consisted of 10 Companhias Indigenas native companies, the elite Guarda Republicana de Lourenço marks of white cavalry, black infantry and a mixed artillery battery, and 1 other artillery battery. The big chartered companies which administered much of the territory had some armed police. Although the Portuguese did not enter the war immediately, they prudently sent out metropolitan reinforcements. These amounted to an infantry battalion, a cavalry squadron, a 4-gun mountain artillery battery, and engineer, medical and services detachments, in all 1,527 men. This force found the northern region to be virtually undeveloped, and the troops spent their time constructing roads and fortified posts along the frontier with German East Africa. A native company had an establishment of 250 askaris with a white captain, for junior officers and white NCOs down to corporal, producing a ratio of Europeans to Africans closer to that of the German than the British or Belgian equivalents. The askaris carried M1887 8mm Kropatschek rifles, the machine gun sections using the Hotchkiss or Nordenfeld, and the artillery the bronze 70mm M188 to mountain gun. a sturdy but obsolete breech loader lacking any recoil mechanism. The White Portuguese units were organized along similar lines to other European armies, and their weapons were modern. The infantry carrying the 1904 pattern 6.5mm Mauser Vergueiro and the artillery and cavalry 8mm Mannlicher carbines. The machine gun was the reliable Maxim, and the standard artillery piece was the 75mm mountain gun, a version of the excellent French 75 which could be broken down into sections. Time alone would tell how effectively the Portuguese would be able to use them. Gen. Smuts replaces Smith-Dorrien. Allies gain control of Lake Tanganyika. British offensive from B begins. Belgian offensive from Congo begins. Van de Venter captures Kondoa-Irangi. Rhodesian Nyasaland field force offensive begins. Portuguese attempt to cross Rufiji repulsed. Van de Venter takes Dodoma. Smuts takes Morogoro. Dar es Salaam surrenders. Belgians take Tabora. Portuguese cross Rovuma. And in following days advance to Navala. British land at Kilwa and Lindi. British offensive ends. Portuguese driven out of Navala and back across Rovuma. Gen. Smuts relinquishes command, replaced by Hoskins and later made by Van de Venter. Wincken's foray into northern German East Africa. German forays into northern Mozambique. British offensive from Kilwa begins. Belgian offensive towards Mahinge begins. Call. Von Lettow promoted to Major General. Belgians take Mahinge. Costly German victory at Mahiwa Kilwa. Belgians help to reinforce Kilwa. Von Lettow crosses into Mozambique and defeats Portuguese at Ngomano. British land at Porto Emi acutely. Germans menace Quelimane and beat Anglo-Portuguese force at Namakura. Germany tries to supply Schutztrupp by Zeppelin. Von Lettow recrosses into German East Africa. Von Lettow enters northern Rhodesia. Von Lettow surrenders near Abercorn. The campaigns, the first phase, 1914–15. The first major offensive of the war was a British attempt to capture the port of Tonga from the sea in November 1914. This involved Indian Expeditionary Force B, consisting of the 27th Indian Army Brigade, and another made up of units supplied by the Indian princely states under the Imperial Service Scheme. The 27th included the 2nd Loyal North Lancashire Ret, the only regular British unit to serve in the theatre throughout the entire campaign. The landing was a disaster. The Royal Navy, which had previously agreed with the Germans that Tonga should be an open port, chivalrously insisted on giving them notice that it was coming. And Von Lettow was able to rush troops to reinforce the single companies stationed in the vicinity. Some of the Indian troops involved were not of the best, and were stopped by a combination of German small arms fire and a swarm of maddened wild bees. One British signaller was awarded the DSO for continuing to take a message while being stung up to 400 times. On the third day the expedition re-embarked, abandoning considerable quantities of arms and ammunition which the jubilant Germans quickly turned to their own use. Schutztrupp morale soared, while that of the British plummeted. The defeated troops withdrew to Mombasa to lick their wounds, and were then deployed along the vulnerable Uganda Railway. There they joined the members of Indian Expeditionary Force C, which had already arrived in British East Africa. This had one regular Indian battalion and 4 Imperial Service half battalions, together with a mountain battery and a volunteer field battery. Over the following year both sides launched a number of smaller attacks along the other fronts, but these were mostly pinpricks designed to keep the opposition off balance. One German officer even assaulted a Portuguese post in August 1914, apparently under the impression that the reported dispatch of Portuguese reinforcements meant that the two countries were at war. In November 1914 the British attacked German positions on Mount Longido in the Kilimanjaro sector to support their Tonga operation, but were beaten back. There was raiding and counter-raiding around the shores of Lake Victoria, the British eventually landing at Bukoba in June 1915 and destroying its signal station and other installations before withdrawing again. The Germans also raided Belgian posts across Lake Kivu and Lake Tanganyika, helped by having better armed vessels which gave them command of the waters. The Belgians actually had more men than the Germans in the region, but they needed time to organize and equip these, and were in no position to launch an offensive. The Belgians were, however, able to help the British in both the northern and southern theaters. In the first, they sent a platoon to reinforce the Uganda police on that territory's border with German East Africa. Similar assistance rendered along the northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland borders in the south was even more important. There the Germans had taken the initiative in September 1914 by attacking Karonga in northern Nyasaland, but this assault was repulsed by elements of a First Corps. Abercorn on the northern Rhodesia border was also menaced. The defenders there were Northern Rhodesia Police. Although they fought off the attack, it was clear that they needed reinforcements. These came in the form of a Force Publique battalion from Katanga. Belgian troops remained on that border until November 1915, playing an important part in the successful repulse of a German attack on Sacy in June. For the British, the main focus of the campaign remained the northern sector, where they were forced back onto the defensive by a series of German raids aimed at the vulnerable Uganda Railway. Although these were only small-scale operations, a German demolition patrol typically consisted of 2 or 3 whites, 8 to 20 askaris and some porters to carry the explosives. They inflicted damage which was hard to repair. Moreover, this threat kept the British forces scattered in small detachments along the railway line, often camped out in unhealthy terrain. Under threat from wild animals, some men were lost to lions, and under strain from the need to mount constant patrols. Not surprisingly, morale suffered, and some of the poorer Indian troops proved to be highly susceptible to panic. One of the early frontier actions was to prove a significant pointer to the campaign to come. The Germans had advanced northward along the coast in September 1914 and overrun some British territory. The British counterattacked and cleared it again, whereupon the Germans brought up more troops and forced the surrender of the Indian garrison at Jason in January 1915. This success was dearly bought, for it cost von Lettow 27 of his irreplaceable Germans, including his own second-in-command, together with large quantities of equally irreplaceable ammunition. Wisely, he concluded that he could only afford to fight 3 more such actions, and that he would have to go onto the defensive. Von Lettow was quick to expand the Schutztruppe as soon as war broke out. The Polizeietruppe were quickly reintegrated. They did not form separate police companies, as was done in Cameroon, and all eligible reservists, including the few Austrians living in the colony, were called up. Many of the older men and some Afrikaner settlers volunteered, including the retired Maj. Gen. Wall. This Saxon officer had been in the colony on a family visit and cheerfully put himself under von Lettow's command, first bringing his professional talents to organizing his communications, and then taking over the western sector as field commander. Those volunteers not required for the regular companies were formed into Schütz and Kompagin, Schütz meaning sharpshooter, as opposed to Schütz as in Schutztruppe, meaning protection. These companies varied considerably in strength and effectiveness. Some were simply garrison units, the 1st to 3rd in Dar es Salaam, for instance, the latter made up of seamen from the ships the British had blockaded. Others, the 8th and 9th, were tough mounted infantry, who provided many of the men for the offensive raids into British East Africa. There was also a small company of coastal Arabs, though this soon fell apart. By March 1915 the Germans had formed 16 more Feldkompagnie numbered 15 to 30. FK and 9 Schützenkompagnie 1 to 9 Hensch was also formed but was soon split up among the other units in the southwest. There were 3 Feldbatterien, and a number of other units of different types. The number of askaris in the Feldkompagnie had been increased from 160 to 200, but they continued to have 2 machine guns each. By early 1916 the Schutztruppe had the equivalent of 60 companies and totaled nearly 3,000 Germans and 12,000 askaris. Feldkompagnie numerical designations proper never rose above 30, but there were a number of Abteilungen, which were detachments of varying sizes, reserve companies, which were probably made up of older askaris, and another series designated by letters, which seemed to have been provisional units. The distinction between Feld and Schützenkompagnie was steadily eroded by the cross-posting of both Germans and askaris. Although the company remained the largest permanent unit, the Germans displayed their usual skill in forming larger tactical groups. These flexible groupings were also known as Abteilungen, but they could be distinguished from their smaller namesakes because they bore their commanders' names. A few of the latter were majors, but most were captains. Such groupings varied between 2 and 6 or more Feldkompagnie, sometimes with a field battery attached. Since the chief threat came from British East Africa, most of them were concentrated along that frontier. The German order of battle on the 5th of March 1915 was as the accompanying The arms situation remained precarious, and it was not until the arrival of a blockade runner in April 1915 that more troops could be equipped with M1898 Mauser rifles. Of the 96 machine guns available in 1915, 17 had been captured from the British and 2 from the Belgians. Nor were arms the only problem. The troops needed uniforms, and supplies of khaki materials soon ran out. Ingenious colonists managed to turn their own raw cotton into cloth, and then stain it a yellowish brown using a dye extracted from tree roots. Local hides were turned into boots, and the vital quinine needed to help the German cadres to fight off the endemic fever was extracted. The 2 Indian expeditionary forces which constituted the first British reinforcements were made up as the accompanying Table 2, forced back onto the defensive after their initial setback at Tonga. The British found themselves on the horns of a dilemma of their own making. With every British-born soldier desperately needed in France, the West Africans engaged in Cameroon, the South Africans in German Southwest Africa, and the contingents from the other white dominions and India required for more vital theaters such as Egypt and Mesopotamia. There was no immediate prospect of sending further significant reinforcements to a minor theater, like East Africa. The real answer was to expand the King's African Rifles by recruiting local Africans, as the Germans were already doing for their Schutztruppe. Britain's Askaris had quickly shown themselves to be just as skilled at bushfighting as their German equivalents, and they enjoyed a natural immunity to the diseases which were already laying the European and Indian troops low. In January 1915 Henry Kitchener, the Field Marshal's elder brother, was sent out to review the manpower situation. Although the local military commanders recommended an expansion of the corps, the civil authorities were against this, and it was their advice which Kitchener accepted, reporting that he did not consider any significant increase in the local forces to be possible. It is true that this would have required more trained white officers and NCOs, both of whom were in short supply at the time. But it is hard to avoid seeing in his assessment an element of racial unease at the prospect of increasing the military potential of the colonial native population. Although this appears in view of the use the British were continuing to make of black troops in West Africa, not to mention their contribution to his brother's victories in the Sudan in 1898. The British also turned down a private offer to raise a battalion of Swazis and another of Zulus. The result was that they were restricted to a mere handful of reinforcements. The only additional British troops that the War Office could find were the 25th Royal Fusiliers, an army battalion recruited from the Legion of Frontiersmen, an association of former adventurers. Although many were really too old for active campaigning, they were both experienced and salted as far as tropical diseases were concerned. Some other acclimatized white volunteers in the form of the newly raised 2nd Rhodesia Red also arrived, together with a squadron of the 17th Cavalry and the 130th Baluchis from the Indian Army. The white inhabitants of the East African Protectorate formed a number of small volunteer units. These were then regimented as the East African Mounted Rifles, and the East African Red and Infantry Unit with 2 European and 1 Pathan company, the former in particular playing an important part in the early clashes. During 1915, however, many had to be transferred to the expanding service units where their local knowledge was more needed, and the mounted rifles dwindled from their original 6 squadrons to 4. The whites in Uganda formed the Uganda Volunteer Rifles, and those from Zanzibar joined the Zanzibar Volunteer Defense Force. Although no new corps battalions were formed, the 1st, 3rd and 4th were brought up to strength and a number of other native units were created, namely the East Africa Protectorate Police BN, the Arab Rifles from the coastal region, a Uganda Police Service BN, the Uganda Armed Levies, later the Baganda Rifles, and Zanzibar's African Rifles, a force raised from the Zanzibar Armed Constabulary. These battalion-sized units were officered by whites from the Protectorate Police or volunteer forces. The same pattern was repeated on the southwestern front. The whites in Nyasaland already had a defense force organized along rifle club lines. It raised a volunteer company from its younger and fitter members in 1914, and this saw service along the border. The whites in Northern Rhodesia formed a volunteer unit known as the Northern Rhodesia Rifles, with a mobile company and local defense sections. The mobile company also saw service on the border, along with the Askaris of the Northern Rhodesia Police Service companies. The more numerous whites in southern Rhodesia provided volunteers for the 2nd Rhodesia Ret. The 1st served in German Southwest Africa, and the British South Africa Police raised to service companies for the Northern Rhodesia Front. The Belgians took even longer to organize their forces. This was understandable, because the Germans had occupied most of Belgium itself. Fortunately for the Allies, the Katangans were better prepared for war than the rest of the Force Publique, which was hard put to it to scrape together a single company to help the French against the Germans. In Cameroon, the Katangans quickly organized themselves into 3 battalions, of which 2 and 3 were dispatched to the northern Rhodesia frontier, while the 2 helped to defend the eastern frontier and lakeshore settlements. The Force Publique remained on the defensive throughout 1915, but it was expanded and reorganized with the aid of officers and NCOs sent out from Belgium. The non-Katangan battalions were assembled from a miscellaneous collection of old and new units, the 11 East Battalion, for example, being formed from the 2 Compagnie de Marche de Basile, the Compagnie du Hotel, and the 3 Compagnie du Camp de la Toda. The battalion was originally numbered the 3 East, but this designation was subsequently changed to 11 East to avoid confusion with the Katangan unit. The overall plan was to organize the forces in the east into 3 groups roughly, brigades, to be known as Kivu, Ruzizi and Tanganyika. Between them these were to have a total of 15 battalions structured along the same lines as the Katangan units. These had 3 rifle companies each, a support section with 2 Maxim machine guns and 2 47mm Nordenfeldt cannon. The Force Publique was traditionally strong in artillery, a doctor and a chaplain. The Belgians also had to create a supply and transport organization almost from scratch. The Belgian Askaris were to be rearmed with modern rifles instead of their antique Albinis, ammunition for which was already becoming scarce. However, this proved to be a problem because the Germans had overrun Belgium's armaments factories. The French came to the rescue, and although the Katangans retained their Mausers, most of the new Force Publique battalions were equipped with single-shot 8mm Grass rifles, with 8mm Hotchkiss or Saint Etienne machine guns instead of Maxims, and 70mm Saint Chamond guns in place of the 47mm Nordenfeldts. The French also provided some of their Delattre system mortars, and the Belgians formed a Compagnie de Grenadiers to operate them. These Askaris were drawn from the men who had been fighting in Cameroon, and were transferred to the east with their new equipment. The Belgians also began the immense labor of transferring 2 of their 160mm guns from the fort at the mouth of the Congo River to the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Though by the time they finally got them there the German threat had receded. Portugal remained neutral throughout 1915, and the single German company in the south was kept there more to deter a native revolt than out of any fear of the Portuguese. Von Leto even wanted to bring it north, but Governor Schnee refused to permit this. The European troops of the 1st Expeditionary Force soon began to succumb to fever, so Lisbon sent a second contingent to replace them in October 1915. It was similar in composition to the first except that a machine gun group was added, no doubt on the basis of reports from the Western Front. The colony began to organize its own additional units. These were called Companhias Indigenas Expeditionarias because they were meant to operate outside the confines of the colony proper, i.e. within the northern part of the territory, which was controlled by the Nyassa Company, or possibly in German East Africa. There were also 5 Baterias Indigenas de Metralladores machine gun batteries. The 2 main chartered companies also began to form their armed police into infantry companies. The Mocambique Company eventually raised 4 of these and the Nyassa Company too. The 1916 Allied Offensive. By the beginning of 1916 the Allies were ready to go over to the attack. Lord Kitchener was opposed to any diversion of effort away from Europe, but the British government had overruled him. A South African expeditionary force was arriving in East Africa, while the Belgians had nearly finished reorganizing their forces. The British command was entrusted to Lt. Gen. Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, a survivor of Eisenhower in 1879, who had distinguished himself as a corps commander in the retreat from Minsk, but he contracted pneumonia on the way out, and was replaced by South Africa's LTG and Gen Smuts in February 1916. Silmai Clever Jenny had been one of Britain's most elusive opponents during the Boer War. Now, he found himself in the position of a gamekeeper trying to capture an equally elusive poacher, in the shape of Von Leto. His South Africans gave Smuts a comfortable margin of superiority in the north. Initially they consisted of 1 mounted and 2 infantry brigades, plus an artillery brigade of 5 batteries. These troops were all white. There was also a Cape Corps battalion recruited from the Cape-colored population and paid for by the British government, though officered by South Africans in all. Some 18,000 Cape Corps personnel were to serve in East Africa, indicating that many must have been on detached duties. Two more Indian Army battalions, extra artillery and a number of armored cars arrived as well. The South Africans also sent 2 infantry battalions and a battery of field artillery to join the Rhodesia and Nyasaland Field Force. The infantry were paid for by the British government and known as rifles, while the gunners were from a regular South African unit which had been re-equipped with 6 German 75mm mountain guns captured. And in Southwest Africa, the Allies planned a number of concentric attacks. The main assault was to come from Smuts' own British Imperial and South African Army in the northeast, but a smaller British column from Uganda was to drive southwards from Lake Victoria, while the Belgians were to advance into Rwanda and Burundi, and then on Tabor. Another British force was to thrust northeastwards from the northern Rhodesia border, while yet more troops would land along the coast to try to prevent the Germans receiving any more seaborne supplies. In February 1916, the British had 27,350 men on the British East Africa front, with 1,900 more in Uganda's Lake Force. By May there were another 2,593 men operating out of northern Rhodesia, albeit at the end of very slender lines of communication. The Belgians mustered a strike force of 12,417, with more troops covering the western lake shores. By this time the Germans had 2,712 Europeans, 11,367 Askaris, and 2,531 irregulars, including armed porters. The British and Belgians were therefore putting nearly 45,000 men into the field against some 16,000 Germans, odds of nearly 3 to 1. The Belgians had pointed out the value of a Portuguese advance from the south. Portugal was not yet in the war, but tension was growing between Germany and Portugal. It was resolved by a German declaration of war in March 1916. The Portuguese then sent out a third and stronger expedition which added 4,538 European troops to the 5,000 or so Africans available by 191. 11,926 Askaris were raised in Mozambique during the war as a whole, though neither the Germans nor the British seemed to have taken either very seriously. Smuts' strategy was to use his superior strength to pin the enemy by a frontal attack while sending another force on his flank. The Germans were supposed to stay still and allow themselves to be enveloped, but they refused to be so accommodating. Time after time they managed to slip away before the outflanking force could work round to their rear. The basic problem was that the country was difficult to move across quickly, and von Lettow had the shorter interior lines. This was demonstrated as soon as the main offensive began in February 1916. The obvious gateway into German East Africa was through the Taveta Gap in the line of hills just to the south of Mount Kilimanjaro. Smuts tried his preferred tactics there, sending his 1st Division to loop around the northern slopes of the Great Volcano to take the German in the rear. Von Lettow simply evaded this ponderous encircling movement and moved a little way down the Usambara Railway, which connected the fertile Kilimanjaro district with Tonga. Smuts thought he had a secret weapon in the form of his South African Mounted Brigade, which he calculated would give him the advantage of strategic mobility. He knew that the tsetse fly would eventually kill its horses, but underestimated the speed with which this could happen. He asked for a 2nd Mounted Brigade from Cape Town. It arrived in May, and then launched Gen. Van Deventer with the 1st Brigade across country towards Kondoa-Rangi, a communications center halfway between the two German railways. This bold advance succeeded, but only at great cost in horseflesh, which left the brigade immobilized. Fortunately, its supporting infantry managed to reach it before von Lettow could concentrate his own troops for an overwhelming counterattack. The force facing Smuts' main advance continued to retreat down the Usambara Railway, fighting delaying actions as it went. The campaign continued along these lines. Van Deventer's troops eventually got going again, mostly on foot, and reached the Central Railway at Dodoma, cutting von Lettow off from his forces in the west. The main German body continued to inflict casualties and then slip away, evading Smuts' attempts to encircle it. Smuts hoped that von Lettow would retreat as far as Tonga or Dar es Salaam, then fight one final battle before negotiating an honorable surrender. But the wily German had no intention of doing any such thing. Instead, he slipped away towards the Rufiji River, past the Nguru and Alaguru Mountains and then even further south, drawing Smuts troops after him. Meanwhile, the Belgians were advancing. In April, they moved into Rwanda and Burundi and began a two-pronged advance on Tabor. Their Brigade Nord struck towards Lake Victoria and then turned south, while Brigade Sud marched down the eastern side of Lake Tanganyika to Kigoma, then began to move down the Central Railway. Britain's Lake Force landed at Mwanza in July and also headed for Tabor, but the Belgians won the race, capturing the town in mid-September. The Belgian advance was facilitated by a remarkable feat of inter-services cooperation. German armed steamers dominated Lake Tanganyika and would have been a threat to Belgian communications. In June 1915, the British shipped two fast-armed launches to the Cape. These were then transported by rail to the Belgian Congo and dragged the rest of the way overland to the lake. They sank one of the German steamers in February 1916, and the other shut itself up in port, where it was eventually put out of action by bombs from a Belgian seaplane. The German General's Western force was too weak to do more than fall back before the light advance, conducting the usual skillful fighting retreat. With Van Deventer's South Africans now astride the Central Railway, Wall had to head southeastward. This took him across the line of advance of Nordies Nyasaland and Rhodesia Field Force, which had begun to move northeastward towards Iringa in May. For once the Germans in the region outnumbered the British, but Smuts quickly dispatched Van Deventer to Northey's aid, and Wall's one serious attempt to take a lightly garrisoned supply depot was fought off by a company with 3 antique muzzle-loading guns. By September 1916, the Germans had been confined to the southernmost third of their colony. The British had occupied all their ports, and they were beset on all sides. At this point, the Portuguese made their move. An attempt to cross the Rovuma River back in May had been repulsed. However, Lisbon urged its commanders to take the offensive again, saying that failure to do so would lower the nation's military prestige. Although sickly and dispirited, the Portuguese troops made another effort. This time they managed to cross the river and launched a drive towards Lindi. However, they were counterattacked at Naval in October and driven back across the Rovuma in disorder. They settled down to try to hold its line. War in the bush being now, the British Imperial troops were exhausted. It was not so much battle casualties as disease which had worn them down. The land harbored tsetse flies, malaria-bearing mosquitoes, burrowing jigger fleas which caused intolerable itching and then ulcers, ticks, and countless other pests, as well as dangerous wild animals. Water was often scarce, and frequently bad. Fever and dysentery were endemic. The South Africans and Rhodesians were no more immune to these ills than the British or Indians, and most of the European and Indian units had been reduced to mere cadres by October 1916. The incidence of disease was increased by the privations imposed by the land itself. The bush which covered the theater varied from a largely waterless steppe to razor-edged grass which could grow to shoulder height, interspersed with thickets of impenetrable thorn scrub. There were jungles and swamps by the coast and along the river courses, and steep, rocky hills with plunging escarpments further inland. Worst of all was the fact that the land produced little in the way of a food surplus at the best of times, and the retreating Germans scoured it clean. The Allied troops were forced to depend on provisions brought forward along increasingly tenuous supply lines. The tracks were poor to start with, and rapidly collapsed under the weight of traffic. Horses and mules died, oxen were slow and refractory, and mechanical transport broke down or became bogged. Food, ammunition, clothing and boots were in short supply. One British officer sent back a series of increasingly angry complaints about the way his frontline troops were being starved. When he finally got back to the base, he insisted on apologizing, having seen the track. He said he was amazed that anything had been got up to them at all. In these circumstances, there was no alternative to headportering. However, as another British officer recalled, the carriers sickened and died at an alarming rate. His concern seems to have been more for the supplies than for the porters themselves, but it must have been a great deal more alarming for the latter, since most were unwilling conscripts with little interest in the outcome of the conflict. Part of the problem was that the Allies' carriers were taken away from the wives who normally cooked for them, and they had neither the time nor the skills to prepare their staple grain ration properly. It was some time before the problem was diagnosed and a special, quick-cook porridge meal was made available. The German carriers' wives accompanied their men, and the latter seemed to have been better motivated, probably because they were assigned to specific companies. They remained loyal throughout, many stepping up to become askaris themselves when the opportunity rose. Uniforms and were part of a well-drilled team. In the Northern Rhodesia Police, the tripod bearer followed the gun's No. 1, a white officer or NCO with the No. 2 and the gun carriers immediately behind and the ammunition porters in the rear. As soon as action was joined, most were ambushes where the need to return fire as quickly as possible was imperative. The No. 1 selected his spot. The tripod bearer put his burden down there and the gun carriers doubled forward to set the preloaded gun on it. Similar drills were used in the other armies. The heavy, tripod-mounted machine gun with its fixed elevation was found to be the most effective weapon in the bush, because even well-trained riflemen from both sides tended to fire too high. And the difficulty of transporting and supplying anything heavier meant that the artillery barrages of the Western Front were unknown. Hand grenades, light machine guns and mortars were relatively late in reaching the theater, and since the Germans were cut off from the outside, they never got any at all, although they could and did improvise landmines. The result was that this remained a rather old-fashioned infantry war. Skirmish lines were the norm, and the cover afforded by the thick vegetation meant that bayonet charges could be surprisingly effective. However, both sides entrenched themselves enthusiastically whenever they had to hold a fixed position. Forces in place. 1916 There were no major changes to the German lineup. The sequence of lettered Schutztrupp companies reached S, but a number of the earlier ones disappeared, along with some of the regular units. The 28th Philcompagnie surrendered to Van Deventer's troops after trying to oppose their advance to Kondoirangi, while 6, 8, 12, 16, 25, 26, 27, and 30 Philcompagnie and 7 Schütz and Compagnie had all vanished by October 1917. On the credit side, more of the askaris had been equipped with modern rifles captured from their opponents, while the sunken Königsberg's 105mm guns had been retrieved and mounted on carriages to add weight to the artillery. Von Leto and his men were in good heart, and a good deal better fed than their opponents. There was no fixed or regular order of battle above the company level. The Abteilungen were reshuffled almost daily to meet the needs of the moment. Moreover, they increasingly split up into separate columns on the march so as to cover as much food-producing territory as possible. The South African Expeditionary Force arrived at the beginning of 1916, together with more Indian battalions, further British artillery units, 3 sections of armored cars, more services, and a Royal Naval Air Service detachment with both aircraft and 4 armored cars. In March 1916, the main British Imperial Strike Force operating out of the East Africa Protectorate was organized into 1st and 2nd Divisions, together with a flank force composed of the 1st SAW Mounted and 3rd SAW Infantry Brigades. With the exception of the last, the different nationalities were mixed up together. However, Smuts then reorganized his command so that the British and Indian troops were concentrated in the 1st Division with the South Africans in the 2nd and 3rd Divisions. Apart from the Admirable Kashmiris, the Indian Imperial Service units were restricted to line of communications work. The order of battle at the beginning of April 1916 was as the accompanying Table 3, although it continued to change throughout the year. The locally raised white units decreased in importance during 1916, even though East Africa had introduced conscription in late 1915, the first British possession to do so. The East African Ret disappeared, while the East African mounted rifles continued to dwindle, falling to a strength of only 1 company by the end of the year, the men either returning to their civilian occupations or being transferred to staff the ever-increasing and vitally important service units. The authorities continued to oppose any significant expansion of the CAR, despite the proven prowess of the existing askaris in bush fighting and their immunity to the local diseases. East African settler opposition had a good deal to do with this, but the South Africans also disliked the idea of arming Africans. And it was not until Smuts' white and Indian troops had been decimated by disease that the policy was changed. The 2nd and 5th KR were raised during the first half of 1916, and the 2nd, 3rd and 4th were then doubled, but that was as far as expansion went for the time being. By April 1916, the Belgian Congo's troops de l'Est had been organized into 2 brigades, as follows: Brigade Nord 3 Regiment 80, 90, 10 battalions, 3 Acute GT 11E, 1-2E, 13 EBNs, 1E and 3 batteries. Brigade Sud 1er. Ret 1E, 2E, 3 BNs, 2 Ret 4E, 5E, 7 EBNs, 2 E and 4 EBs others, 6 EBN Lake Tonganyika Shore Defense, 14 E and 15 EBNs Occupation Troops, 16 E, 17 E and 18 EBNs retained in Congo for internal security. Once command of the lake had been assured, 6 EBN was able to cross and take part in the advance. Each brigade had a pioneer, signals and service company, and each regiment had an engineer and a machine gun section. The mortars were attached to the Brigade Nord. The troops continued to be armed with a mixture of Grass and Mauser rifles. Although they were more immune to the local diseases than Europeans or Indians, the Belgians Ascaris suffered almost as badly from the privations imposed by the Allies' tenuous supply lines. By July, many of the companies were down to 50 men. However, matters improved once they were astride the Central Railway and could bring supplies down from its Lake Tanganyika terminus. The 2nd Portuguese Expeditionary Force was still in Mozambique in March 1916, and some of its members were involved in the initial fighting. It consisted of the 3rd BN of Regimento de Infanteria No. 21, a machine gun Grupo No. 7, a squadron from Regimento de Cavalleria No. 3, a mountain artillery group, and engineer, medical and service units. The 3rd and larger expedition arrived in July 1916. This was made up of the 3rd Battalions of Regimentos de Infanteria Nos. 23, 24 and 28 and 2 reinforcing companies for No. 21, 3 more machine gun groups and OS.4, 5 and 8, -1 artillery groups Nos. 1 and 2 plus 3 more from the mountain artillery Ret, and engineer, medical and service units. The Portuguese also took steps to expand their Ascari units. Those involved in the crossing of the Rovuma included the Guardia Republicana, a number of Companhias Indigenas Expedicionarias notably Nos. 17 and 19 to 24, and the Nyassa companies 1A Campania. The European battalions provided the main mass, but Ascaris accompanied them, and they were screened by a black column consisting of a European mounted infantry company and 4 African companies. Some Portuguese troopers from Cavalleria No. 3 formed part of the advance towards Navala, but little was heard of this arm thereafter. The Ascaris suffered more battle casualties than the Europeans, but the latter's losses from disease were 10 times those of the Africans. Apart from Capt. Curado's 21A Campania Indigena, which showed what the Ascaris could do with good leadership, the Portuguese demonstrated that they were no match for the Germans. Indeed, the German conclusion was that 500 German troops could safely take the offensive against 1,500 Portuguese. Stalemate, then pursuit. 1917-18. By the end of 1916, the combination of sickness and exhaustion had brought the British Imperial and South African advance to a halt. The Belgians had gone as far as they meant to go, and the Portuguese offensive had been stopped in its tracks. Von Leto might have retreated into the southern third of his territory, but he was still at liberty there and quite capable of inflicting damage on the Allies. Moreover, there was always the risk of his breaking loose. One part of his force did exactly this when Hauptmann Winkens and his detachment struck out on their own account, cut through the British cordon, and headed back north in February 1917. For the next 8 months this little force led the Allies a merry dance until they were finally caught and forced to surrender near the British East Africa border on the 1st of October. Interestingly, by mounted troops, the region was relatively tsetse-free, and only horsemen were able to overhaul the fleet-footed German Ascaris. Von Leto disapproved of this foray, but it helped to keep the Allies off balance. Meanwhile, other German columns were raiding northern Mozambique for food. It was May 1917 before the British got going again, and then it was from the southern ports of Lindi and Kilwa, which they had captured earlier and which von Leto had been investing for months. By now the very complexion of their army had changed. The white troops had been relieved by African units from West Africa, just as skilled as the Germans Ascaris at bushfighting, and for the most part blooded in the Cameroon campaign. Even so, the Indians had to remain for the time being, otherwise British numbers might actually have fallen to less than those of the Germans. The decision to withdraw them entirely was not taken until the end of 1917. Their replacements were to be new battalions of the King's African Rifles, whose recruitment had been set on foot as a matter of urgency by Gen. Hoskins as soon as he took over from Smuts in January. Hoskins was an experienced East Africa hand, but he was pulled out and replaced by Van de Venter in May, even though practically all the South African troops had left by then. The Belgians also set off again in July, this time driving down to take Mahinch. Not only did they help to close the ring from the north, they also sent a couple of battalions to help the British at Kilwa in October. The British needed assistance because their offensive had run into von Leto's Ascaris concentrated at Mahiwa, near the port of Lindi. The Germans had constructed trenches and dugouts and the British attacked them frontally in mid-October. The fighting approached Western Front intensity, and the British lost more than half of their 4,900 men. German losses were lighter, but still amounted to one-third of their 1,500 soldiers. Von Leto claimed the day, but he had to withdraw nonetheless, knowing that he could not afford many more such victories. The Allies were now pressing him hard on all sides. Their forces had been built up again, they had more motor transport, and new weapons such as mortars and hand grenades. Moreover, their African troops were more resistant to the local diseases and better able to live off the land. By November, von Leto had been hemmed into the southernmost corner of the German colony, and it seemed that he could twist and turn no longer. However, those who thought he might surrender had underestimated his devotion to duty. His task was to keep Allied forces engaged in this minor theater. The British, Indian and Southern African troops deployed there might have been withdrawn, but most of them were so debilitated by fever that they weren't likely to be able to fight again anywhere else. Moreover, the Ascaris who were replacing them had to be trained, officered, and equipped with weapons and munitions, all of which represented a drain on the Allied war effort. The Schutztruppe, on the other hand, had learned to live off their enemies and the land. Von Leto did not hesitate. He purged his force of all but its fittest and most determined elements, and in late November 1917 he led these across the Rovuma River and into Mozambique. The Portuguese had been asked to hold the river line, and had a post at Ngomano in the path of the German advance. Although warned of the German approach, its commander inexplicably neglected its defenses until it was too late. The battle-hardened Schutztruppe quickly stormed it and captured food, clothing and weapons before marching on southwards. They continued to overrun and sack isolated Portuguese posts as they did do, collecting more arms and equipment each time. Most of these victories were relatively easy, but at least one garrison, that of Serra-Mecula, put up a resistance stout enough to earn the Germans' respect. Once again, the Allies had to shift their forces and reorganize their cumbersome supply arrangements. The British landed troops PAM force at Porto Amelia, established a base there, and began to move westwards. They also shipped Northey's force down to the southern end of Lake Nyasa and set it to operate eastwards from there. Von Leto slipped past this attempted pincer movement long before the arrangements could be concluded, and headed southwards for Quelimane. Once again, the British had to shift their forces southwards and land there. Von Leto descended on a newly established supply depot at Namakura in July 1918, drove off the Anglo-Portuguese garrison, and looted it thoroughly. Then he feinted eastwards towards the old capital, Mozambique town. As soon as the Allies reacted, he swung back westwards and then headed north. By now, however, the writing was on the wall. Von Leto knew that Germany itself was reeling under the weight of the Allied offensives on the Western Front, and her allies were beginning to collapse. The Germans made one last attempt to help him by sending a Zeppelin laden with supplies from Turkey, and fortunately for them this was tricked into turning back when it was over the Sudan. Von Leto soldiered on, evading the British columns which were trying to pin him down, or checking their pursuit with brief, vicious rearguard actions. He continued to slip away, crossing the frontier back into German East Africa again at the end of September 1918, and then heading westwards until he entered northern Rhodesia. Some considerable way into that territory, and still uncaught, he received news of the armistice in Europe. The incredible odyssey of the Schutztruppe was at an end, but not Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's personal adventure, however. The general returned to Germany to be acclaimed as a hero. Before long the post-war chaos there inspired the irrepressible Prussian to raise his own Freikorps, named Schutztruppe Regiment 1, and with an African lion's head, cross spears and a native shield as its badge. The general led this unit with all his old energy, but it did not last long. He continued to be active in politics, however, and although born in 1870 he survived until the remarkably late date of 1964, visiting East Africa again in 1953 and being held by his old Ascaris. During the last campaign there were no major changes to the organization of the Schutztruppe. The order of battle in mid-October 1917 was as the accompanying table 4. When von Leto decided to cross into Mozambique with a reduced force of no more than 300 Germans and 1,700 Ascaris, with 3,000 carriers, he organized them into 15 companies. These were 2, 3, 4, 9.10, 11, 13, 14, 17, 19, and 21. Philcompagnian 3, 4, 5, and 6. Schützenkompagnie and 2. Battery. Of these 14 and 19. FK and 5 were disbanded during the subsequent campaign. By the time von Leto surrendered, the remaining companies had only 155 Germans and 1,168 Ascaris between them. The Germans still had some of their old M1871 84th Jägerbusch rifles with them, together with 7 of their original Maxims. But most of their other weapons had been captured from either the British, the Belgians or the Portuguese. They had a Portuguese field piece and some shells, together with some captured mortars, although the last of the Königsberg's guns had been blown up before the force left German East Africa. The composition of the British Imperial forces continued to change. By the beginning of 1917 the 2 British battalions had been withdrawn. So had most of the South Africans, leaving only 3rd SA Artillery Battalion, a composite mounted ret, the 7th and 8th SA Infantry, and the Jaegers Scouts. The 1st Cape Corps Battalion was relieved by a 2nd, which remained until 1918. The new units from Africa were led by the single battalion Gold Coast Ret and the 2nd BN West Indian Ret from Freetown, which disembarked in July 1916. The seasoned Gold Coasters joining the main force, and the West Indians who had not fought in Cameroon being employed on coastal operations. A 4-battalion Nigerian BD 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Nigeria Rets, many of them also Cameroon veterans, arrived in late 1916. The Nigerians left in mid-1918, but the Gold Coasters plus a separate mounted infantry company formed for service there in 1918, and West Indians remained until the armistice. The 2nd Rhodesian Native Red arrived in 1917 and was amalgamated with the 1st, transferred from garrison duties in Southwest Africa to the Rhodesian African Rifles in 1918. These 2 battalions were officered by members of the British South Africa Police. Even so, the withdrawal of white units meant that more Indian units had to fill the gap between late 1916 and mid-1917. These were the 30th Punjabis, 55th Frontier Force Rifles, 75th and 109th Infantry and 127th Baluchis, together with the 25th Cavalry replacing the 17th Cavalry Squadron, and a Kashmiri Imperial Service Mountain Battery specifically requested by Gen. Hoskins because of the fine performance of its infantry comrades. 2 of the Indian units involved in this campaign had been sent to East Africa to redeem themselves. The 130th Baluchis had mutinied in 1914 when warned for Mesopotamia. The 5th Light Infantry did so in Singapore in 1915, then being shipped to Cameroon and subsequently on to East Africa. Others were Muslim units, sent because the British did not consider it safe to use them against the Turks. This was the case with the 40th Pathans and 129th Baluchis, who were detached from the Indian Corps when that formation was withdrawn from France and sent to Mesopotamia in late 1915, and the 30th Punjabis, who had been known as the Punjabi Mohammedans up to 1903. All these units fought loyally in East Africa. General Smuts' replacement Gen. Hoskins had served as Inspector General of the Corps before the war, and it was he who started to build that force up in earnest at the beginning of 1917. To begin with, 1st Corps became a 2-battalion regiment, as did the 2nd, 3rd and 4th, though in the British way each battalion continued to operate separately. The 5th KR remained on British East Africa's northern border as a single battalion unit. In mid-1917 a new 6th Corps was raised from captured Schutztruppe Ascaris and was also quickly doubled, while a single battalion 7th Corps was formed from the Zanzibar Armed Constabulary and the Mafia Constabulary. Later in 1917 each of the first 4 regiments added a 3rd battalion, and in 1918 a 4th training battalion. while 4th Corps went on to raise to more when Uganda proved to be a good recruiting area. There was also a car-mounted infantry unit which had been formed as part of 3rd Corps in 1914 but subsequently operated as a separate entity, and a car signals company. The delay in expanding the car led to problems, because the new battalions were raised in a hurry and were consequently not as good as the veteran pre-war units. As a result, some were roughly handled when they came up against the Schutztruppe. Nevertheless, the Corps were largely responsible for the pursuit of von Leto through Mozambique and back to the borders of northern Rhodesia. By November 1918 there were 22 Corps battalions, which were divided between Western Force 1 1st, 2 1st, 3 1st, 1 4th and 2 4th Corps, Eastern Force 1 2nd, 2 2nd, 3 2nd, 1 3rd, 2 3rd, 3 4th and 4 4th Corps, German East Africa Garrison 3 3rd, 5 4th, 2 6th and 1 7th Corps, British East Africa Garrison 1 5th and 1 6th Corps, and training for 1st, 4 2nd, 4 3rd and 6 4th Corps. Significantly, the two battalions raised from turned Askari prisoners of war were assigned to garrison duties, though one found itself involved in the hunt for Winkins and his band. The Northern Rhodesia Police continued to serve with the Rhodesia and Nyasaland Field Force. There were still 5 companies in May 1917, and a 6th was organized later. Only in late 1917 were they brought together to form a battalion. One problem that was taken in hand was the organization of the African colonial units, which was progressively brought into line with the new double company pattern already adopted by the European and the Indian Imperial battalions. This meant that a British Central, East or West African company was now equivalent to a Belgian, German, or Portuguese company, with a similar allocation of machine guns. The British also increased their ratio of white officers and NCOs to Askaris until it equaled the German figure, although they experienced difficulties in finding white personnel familiar with the country and able to speak Swahili, the regional lingua franca. Many of the most suitable men had joined the early white volunteer units and become casualties. In this respect, von Leto's practice of cross-boasting between Feldkompagnen and Schützenkompagnen turned out to be much more practical. The local white volunteer forces themselves had practically disappeared by the beginning of 1917. The East African Rifles lost all its personnel except for its commanding officer, though the local defense sections of the Northern Rhodesia Rifles remained in existence until 1919. British, Indian and South African units carried short magazine Lee-Enfield rifles SMLEs, though some only received these at the start of the campaign. The Corps battalions carried the Lee-Metford or long Lee-Enfield at the start of the war but had all been rearmed with SMLEs by 1918. The West Africans had a similar experience. They actually received the new rifles while they were en route to East Africa. The Northern Rhodesia Police also received SMLEs during the war. The standard medium machine gun remained the Vickers, but Lewis light machine guns were introduced in 1917. Hand grenades and Stokes mortars had begun to arrive in 1916, though they did not come into action until the end of that year. Britain took German East Africa after the war. They renamed it Tanganyika, and it is now the mainland part of Tanzania. The Belgians reduced their troops in German East Africa after they captured Tabor, but the continued German resistance led to the further campaign against Mahinj in 1917. The rifle companies had been reduced to 133 Askaris each, but the brigades now had cyclist companies. The pre-war Belgian army was more enthusiastic than most about these, and the troops de Katanga already had them in 1914. Moreover, the proportion of white cadres to Askaris had been raised close to Schutztruppe levels. The Belgians had absorbed that lesson too. The force consisted of Brigade Sud-Nauler Ret plus 5 EBN, and Brigade Nord's 12 E Battalion. The remainder of Brigade Nord plus 10 EBN were employed in the hunt for Winkin's marauding Schutztruppe company, which lasted until the beginning of October. With Mahinj taken, the 4 E and 9 EBNs, a cyclist company, field hospital and artillery were sent to reinforce the British at Kilwa, remaining in the south until the end of the year. The Force Publique troops made a good impression on the Portuguese, who ranked them ahead of the British colonial units and second only to the Germans. They also impressed the latter. As early as October 1914, Winkens, then commanding the western sector, had warned von Lettow that the Belgian askaris were much better than the Germans had thought. Overall, the Belgians not only achieved all their objectives, but rendered invaluable help to the British on more than one occasion. Belgium's reward after the war was to be the fertile and thickly populated territories of Rwanda and Burundi. The Portuguese were completely exhausted by their efforts during the disastrous Naval campaign, so Lisbon sent out a fourth expeditionary force, which arrived during the first half of 1917. It took the same form as the previous one, namely the 3rd Battalions of 3 infantry regiments Nos. 29, 30 and 31, to mountain artillery batteries and a company of engineers. In all 4,058 Europeans. There were also white cadres for 1 locally recruited cavalry squadron and 20 more infantry companies. The former does not actually seem to have been raised, but further infantry companies certainly were. Their title numbers went up to 45A. However, figures for the campaign as a whole show that the proportion of whites to askaris in the provincial forces was under 6%, which was significantly below the initial German figure, as well as those reached later in the war by the British and Belgians. The Guardia Republicana field unit disappeared. No further reinforcements arrived apart from a naval battalion in 1918. This was made up of exiled mutineers, so its value was doubtful. The new Portuguese commander hoped to renew the offensive and actually organized 2 battalion-sized Grupos das Companhias Indigenas with this in mind. But the British only wanted him to hold the Rovuma River line. The white troops remained near the coast while the native companies were stationed in the interior. Many of the latter remained along the Rovuma even after von Lettow broke through at Negomano in November 1917, because the Allies believed that he would soon turn back north again. The Portuguese continued to be used as static garrisons while British columns pursued the Germans. Officially, this was because a shortage of porters made it difficult to maintain both armies in the field. But privately Van de Venter made it clear that he was unhappy with the quality of the Portuguese troops and did not think that they should be used outside entrenchments. This was, as the Portuguese admit, a fair assessment. A few of their units were good. It was capped. Curados 21, a Companhia Indigena Expedicionario which put up stiff resistance at Serra Mecula. And there were others, like the 11A Companhia Indigena which fought off another German attack. But as a general rule they were inferior in terms of combat power to those of the other countries involved. This was not due to deficiencies of equipment. In fact, the askaris were all rearmed with 6.5mm Mauser Verguero rifles during the campaign. And its relatively small caliber does not seem to have attracted any criticism, but rather to a poor level of training and low morale. The Portuguese themselves concede that many of their officers were reluctant to serve in Africa. Medical boards had to be suspended when the expeditionary forces were being assembled, because so many tried to use these to get out of Goan. However, it must be remembered that Portugal was politically divided over the wisdom of participating in the war at all. From late 1917 onwards the country was actually ruled by a military dictatorship which was reluctant to take any further part, and only did so for fear of losing the colonies it did possess. In this at least the Portuguese effort was successful, though Portugal's only territorial gain was to be a muddy triangle of land at the mouth of the Rovuma which the Germans had taken from them in 1894. Almeida, Belo de Meio Século de Lutas no Ultramar, Sociedade de Geografia de Lisboa, Lisbon, 1937. Annan, História Militar de Madagascar, Imprimerie Nationale Paris, 1931. Annan, La Force Publique de son Association, 1914, Institut Royal Colonial Belgique, Brussels, 1952. Annan, Les Campagnes Coloniales Belges, 1914-18, Minister de la Défense, Brussels, 1927. Annan, South Africa and the Great War, 1914-18, Government Printer, Pretoria, 1923. Bull Ludwig, Die Operation in Ostafrika Weltkrieg, 1914-18, Walter Dachert, Hamburg, 1951. Botelho, J.J. Texier, Historia Militari Politica dos Portugueses em Moçambique, Centro Tipográfica Colonial, Lisbon, 1936. Brailsford, W.V., The Story of the Northern Rhodesia Regiment, Government Printer, Lusaka, 1954. Brown, J. Ambrose, They Fought for King and Kaiser, Ashandi, Johannesburg, 1991. Clifford, Sir Hugh, the Gold Coast Regiment in the East African Campaign. John Murray, London, 1920. Costo, Mario, Iwanimigo Q. Fala, and Prensa Nacional, Larenko Marx, 1932. Gardner, Brian, German East, Castle, London, 1963. Hamley, Richard, The Regiment, TV Bullpen, Cape Town, 1970, modified edition under same title, Covos Day Books, South Africa, 2000. Haywood, A. N. Clark, FAS, History of the RWAFF, Gale and Polden Aldershot, 1964. Hickman, C.U.L. Selwyn, Rhodesia Served the Queen, Government Printer Rhodesia, 1970. Holdern, C. Military Operations in East Africa 1914-16, HMSO London, 1941. Janssens, Altg and Emile, Histoire de la Force Publique, Westmail Challier Namur, 1979. Leto Vorbeck, Jen, Paul Vaughan, My Reminiscences of East Africa, Hurst and Blackett, London, 1920, originally Mean Erner in Ostafrika, Leipzig, 1920. Miller, Charles, Battle for the Bundu, Macmillan, USA 1970 for Moise Bartlett, L.T., Call, H., The King's African Rifles, Gale and Polden Aldershot, 1956. Owen, Christopher, The Rhodesian African Rifles, Leo Cooper, London, 1970. Sibley, Madge, Yair, Tanganyika Guerrilla, Ballantine, USA 1971. Tilden, Madge, G. The Armed Forces of South Africa, Johannesburg 1954, with Adetta Encore Agenda and Africana Notes and News, 1955-1960. The Platessa, German Schutztruppe 1. Sergeant, the white band on the grey home service, and dress cap was the Schutztruppe facing color for Deutsche Ostafrika. The blue piping was common to the white and khaki uniforms worn by all the German members of the force, irrespective of colony. As an imperial force, the Schutztruppe wore only the black, white and red Reichskokarde, and the same colors were intertwined to form the shoulder straps. The NCO's chevrons worn on the left sleeve only were silver backed with blue. A2. Unteroffizier, the imperial colors were also worn as a cord on the tropical helmet. Khaki puttees replaced the earlier blue ones before 1914. Manning a Maxim MG08 machine gun, this corporal wears a machine gunner's traegert or drag strap. The white shirt was normal wear under the tunic at the start of the war. A3 Matros, Imperial Navy SMS Königsberg. This seaman is dressed in Landungsanzug, or landing party dress. The use of the blue uniform was by no means uncommon in tropical climates. British sailors wore them as well. However, this rating has at least rolled his sleeves up and replaced the regulation black leather marching boots with ankle boots and canvas guiders. As a machine gunner, he is equipped with the Model 1904 Marine pistol, A4. Offizier Europeans of all ranks usually wore khaki shirts in the field instead of the regulation tunic. Many of the original white shirts were stained khaki using a locally produced dye extracted from tree roots. Later, a great many captured garments were worn. This officer carries the Pistolo 8. A5 Matros, Abteilung Königsberg. The crew of the cruiser Königsberg were incorporated into the Schutztruppe as a separate detachment. Like his shipmate A3, he wears Landungsanzug, in this case in white. The tropical helmet is of the older pattern with a less pronounced peak and neck shade. The machine gun is set on an improvised anti-aircraft mounting in an attempt to protect the ship seen in the background from British aerial reconnaissance while it was hidden in the Rufiji Delta. Later its upper works were painted green and covered with branches. B. German Schutztruppe 1 Schausch, Busekorps, 1914. Many of the original East African askaris were Sudanese, and the Schutztruppe continued to use the Turkish titles common throughout Northeast Africa. An African officer was an Effendi 3 silver stars on the shoulder strap, a Feldwebel was a Saal for flat-topped chevrons, a sergeant was a Betschausch 3 chevrons, an Unteroffizier a Schausch 2 chevrons, and a Gefreiter an Ambascha 1 chevron. Later pattern NCO's chevrons were brown instead of red. The Feldkompagnie number was worn on the fez cover when in field dress. Bandsmen wore the traditional swallow's nests at the shoulder. This one carries the Mauser M1871 84th Jäger books with the appropriate cartridge pouches. B2 Schausch, Polizeietruppe, 1915. Although by this date he has acquired a captured bandolier and a non-regulation hat, this NCO has retained his older red sleeve chevrons. He is armed with a Mauser Modell 98 Infanterie Gewehr with the later model cartridge pouches. B3. Ambasha, 1914. This senior private carries the Reichsflag in an oilskin cover, and wears the field equipment that was regulation at the start of the war. Later the fez was either replaced by a shapeless hat CB2, or else camouflaged with grass stems or leaves so that it resembled a tall clump of vegetation. Hauptmann Tafel, one of von Leto's most experienced aides, seems to have been the first to suggest this measure, which helped the Scarus to spring a good many successful ambushes. Before Ruga like their opponents, the Germans made use of tribal irregulars. This warrior is from the Wahia, a tribe that had been responsible for the worst reverse the Germans suffered during the colonial period, and who were not finally defeated until 1898. He carries a single-shot, black powder Mauser Modell 71 carbine. Based on the image provided, here is the text transcription. B5 Ambasho, Polizeiatrupp, 1914. The Polizei were incorporated into the Schutztruppe proper soon after hostilities began, but this man has retained his red-on-white peace-sleeve device. The spread-winged eagle badge on the fez cover had the imperial crown above, and a shield bearing a second eagle on its breast. It resembled that worn by the Mariner Corps except in having no anchor motif. He carries the Mauser M1871 84th Jäger books. C. British Troops 1 Officer, 3rd Battalion, King's African Rifles. This kepi-like cap with a fold-up peak was introduced in about 1912, at the same time as a low pillbox-fueled cap in the same color for a Scarus. The idea may have been to make it harder for enemy snipers to single out the white officers. But in practice the cap never wholly replaced the distinctive tropical helmet. The tunic was standard British Army pattern tropical drill with the open collar introduced in 1913. The only unique device was the Arabic battalion numeral on a red patch on the left side of the headgear. Here 3 on a diamond shape, though note the matching red lanyard. The 4th car wore an Arabic 4 on a green diamond, but the first officers had a black square bearing 1st car in green. The rear-raised 2nd car wore dark blue flashes. The colors for the 5th, 6th and 7th BNs do not seem to have been recorded, though the first 2 were probably light blue and brown respectively. C2. Corporal, East African Mounted Rifles. This local volunteer unit was not fully equipped until July 1915, and its first members wore a mixture of items. The slouch hat with its leopard skin pagri is civilian, as are the laced riding boots. The collarless pullover shirt is the British greyback with added breast pockets, while the leather equipment is the standard 1903 bandolier pattern for mounted troops. The weapon is the volunteer's own, a heavy double-barreled sporting rifle intended for hunting big game. C3 Maasai warriors. Like the Germans, the British employed the services of this warlike people, who had long dominated the arid interior. Apart from the lion's mane headdress worn by the figures in the background, Maasai warriors wore nothing more than a skin cloak, leaving them, as the Victorian explorer Joseph Thomson delicately expressed it, ready alike for love or for war. The spear and sword were useful against wild beasts, if not a rifle-armed enemy is scary. The shield pattern showed the wearer's clan and status. The small suns indicated the number of men he had killed in battle. C4. Dorobo warrior. The Maasai were not the only tribe to be recruited. This figure is a Dorobo elephant hunter equipped with bow and arrows as well as a short sword, leather equipment, and a Martini Enfield rifle. The fez under the khaki cover was red. The Roman numeral 3 on this cover was also a pre-war distinction. An Arabic 3 on a red diamond CC1 replaced it on the pillbox-fueled cap. Wartime car battalions were differently shaped patches. The standard sequence seems to have been a diamond 1st, rectangle 2nd, triangle 3rd, semicircle 4th, star 5th, and disc 6th. Though there were variations, the first KR's Ascaris had a black band, and the Rhodesian African Rifles a yellow one. The blanket was usually worn over the left shoulder in field order. D2. Lance Corporal, 25th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers Legion of Frontiersmen. He wears regulation British khaki drill service dress, with 1908 pattern web equipment. In the bush, shirt sleeves and shorts were far more common. The 1895 long Lee Enfield rifle was soon replaced by the short magazine pattern. D3. Nate Corporal, 30th Punjab Regiment Indian troops wore a khaki turban with khaki drill kirtle long-sleeved blouse with a low collar, baggy breeches, and khaki serge puttees. Rifle equipment was of the 1903 bandolier pattern, with a brown waist belt bearing two pouches on either side. At this period few Indian rank and file wore headdress badges, the only regimental insignia being a brass shoulder title. This NCO carries the 1895 Longley Enfield. D4 Askari, Northern Rhodesia Police normal service dress throughout the war for this force consisted of a short-sleeved blouse and shorts, with bare legs and feet. The black fez typical of Central African units it was. Text cuts off South African troops 1 Bombardier, South African Field Artillery. This corps cap badge was similar to that of Britain's Royal Artillery, except that the upper scroll bore laurel leaves instead of ubique, and the lower one read South Africa. A small brass grenade badge was worn on the collar, obscured here by the bandolier equipment. A gun badge was worn with NCO's badges of rank. Before 1920 a single chevron identified bombardier, equivalent to corporal. Some gunners wore blue puttees. The 5th Battery came from the Union's pre-war regular South African mounted rifles and had the helmet flash colors reversed. The rifle is the short magazine Lee Enfield. A2 Private, South African Infantry. The shirt, shorts and puttees were normal wear for dismounted troops. Since units in the field quickly outstripped all but the most essential of supplies, they were often all that they had, and the bush thorns left them in tatters. The general service badge on the helmet was a springbox head facing to the wearer's right within a circle. It inscribed Union is strength and drac mock matched. Irreverent Australians dubbed this the goat in a porthole. The battalions were distinguished by helmet flashes. The 5th had a green and white diamond, the 6th a blue and gold diamond, the 7th a white and maroon diamond, the 8th crimson and gold diagonals, the 9th green and gold divided vertically, the 10th a white saltire on a blue diamond, the 11th a black and amber triangle, and the 12th green and black, with a maroon and gold diamond.